program was established at the Yale School of Management in 1980 by Becton Dickinson and Company, a leading global medical instrument supplier, in honor of Henry P. Becton, class of 37 of the college, Yale College, and chairman of the company from 1961 to 1987. And the purpose was to bring practitioners from private and public institutions to share their professional insights with faculty and students. And we're fortunate to have Andrea Levere visiting us and participating in this. I have to say, I feel very, very fortunate that I got to meet Andrea in person very shortly before we all had to flee the building. Okay, so that was really good, and I feel like, okay, I was able to make an initial connection, and been looking forward to this talk. And Andrea is, of course, a proud alum of Yale School of Management, but she is now visiting us as virtually as an executive fellow, hosted by the International Center for Finance, ICF, in partnership with the Program for Social Enterprise. And in this role, Andrea is leading an initiative focused on expanding equitable finance for nonprofits and social ventures, ranging from products such as philanthropic equity to strategies to expand impact investing. She's also President Emerita of Prosperity Now, formerly called CFED, a private nonprofit organization with the mission of ensuring that everyone can gain financial stability, build wealth, and achieve prosperity. It designs and operates major national initiatives that aim to integrate financial capability services into systems serving low-income people, build assets and savings, and close the racial wealth divide, and advance research and policies that expands economic mobility for all. Just as an aside, I think we all realize in this time that we're in how critically important this kind of work is, and how disproportionately people of different economic situations are impacted by what's going on. Some have savings and assets build up that enable them to weather the storm, and too many unfortunately do not. And it's exactly this kind of work that would build financial resilience for many in our society would help in just these moments that we're in now. So it's really, really timely to talk about this. I also say Andrea stepped down in August 2019 after spending 15 years as president and 27 years with the organization, Prosperity Now. And in 2013, President Obama appointed Ms. Levere to the National Cooperative Bank's Board of Directors, and she was a member of the Community Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Board of Government for 3 years, and served as chair in 2019. She's the founding investor and chair of ROC USA, a national social venture that converts manufactured home parks into resident-owned cooperatives. And she was formerly a member of the FDIC's Committee on Economic Inclusion, Morgan Stanley's Community Development Advisory Board, Capital One's Community Advisory Council. You can see a real theme here. Everyone wants Andrea's advice on these issues, and she's been chair of the board of directors of the NIST Foundation for Women. She holds a BA from Brown University. As I said, is also a proud alum of Yale SOM. So with no further ado, we're at 44 people. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dean Pinker. I couldn't have done that better than myself, particularly in terms of the implications of the work that I have spent my career doing and how it shows up in the world today. So thank you so much for that. So with that, I want to thank you for this honor and for this opportunity. And I want to welcome all the students, the staff, the faculty, and guests who are joining us today. And I want to thank all of you for everything you're doing to keep us safe and healthy, as well as everything you're doing to support those around us who need our help during this time. I have 3 goals today. One is to give a pretty brief overview of my career. I think the dean did a great job in describing it. Then to really focus in on key measures of wealth inequality that shape the work that I did at Prosperity Now, and also are absolutely predictive of what we're seeing in the disparities with the COVID-19 epidemic. And then I'm going to describe my work as an executive fellow with the International Center for Finance. And if the work I was doing was relevant before COVID-19, it has been absolutely raised up in its importance since then. So let's begin. And let's begin with a quote from someone I'm sure most of you know, Will Getzman, who's the director of the International Center for Finance, and is in many ways the reason why I became an executive fellow. And it really begins with this quote, that widespread equity investment is a way to share the benefits of economic growth. We typically think of equity as a way of financing an enterprise, a way to raise capital for a business from investors. However, equity investment can also be seen as a tool for spreading the wealth. And it was really this common purpose that Will saw, as well as the extraordinary staff at ICF, and I want to welcome Leanne Clark, who's also here with us, and her great team, to think about how do we truly address the wealth inequality in the nation, and what can be done by leveraging the tools of finance. So, how did I get interested in this? So my journey, which I love, is from SOM to SOM. And what I was stunned by, Dean Pinker, is that the Becton Fellowship existed even before I started, which is a long, long time ago. And I was a student in the early days and was part of a group of students who actually went to business school for the first time. They couldn't imagine that in a means to pursue a career in economic and social justice. When I graduated, I decided that finance was the most important tool to be able to advance economic and social justice. And I worked for a national nonprofit organization that was very much like a public sector investment banker, and worked with cities and states all over the country to structure financing for small business, inner city development, and low-income housing. What's been fascinating is all the skills and tools I learned to use working for NDC in the 1980s are coming roaring back with the PPP and other tools that are part of the CARES Act and the stimulus programs. In 1992, I left NDC to join what was then the Corporation for Enterprise Development. And as you can all say, anybody with branding experience, we did a really great job renaming ourselves several years ago to Prosperity Now. And I did that for a few reasons, one of which being that I felt that in order to make the kind of change that was necessary, we needed to add policy to the toolkit. And Prosperity Now did both programmatic work, policy work, and also worked deeply with private markets and community practitioners to test and scale products and services that build wealth. As the dean said, I had the incredible opportunity when I stepped down from Prosperity Now to become an executive fellow and really focus in on an issue that had come to me when I gave the keynote address 2 years ago at the Yale Philanthropy Conference about why did philanthropy violate every rule of finance that I had learned at SOM. So here's what I proposed and was thankfully accepted by the ICF team, which was to really apply the finance lessons that I learned to increase access to and the supply of philanthropic equity or enterprise capital for nonprofits and social enterprises, along with access to subsidized debt, which is broadly referred to as equitable finance. This initiative was hosted by ICF in partnership with the Program on Social Enterprise. I was incredibly lucky that Tony Sheldon, the executive director, and I were at SOM. We overlapped for 1 year, and our careers have connected multiple times over the past several decades. And what we were able to do with support from ICF is to really convene a whole range of players, conduct research, engage extensively with students, collaborate with faculty and lecture in the classroom, and really bring leaders from philanthropy, impact investing, and the social sector to campus. So let me just frame out kind of why we were thinking big at the launch of this project last fall. And one of my great mentors is Clara Miller, who founded the Nonprofit Finance Fund and then became the president of the Heron Foundation in New York. And she was always at the cutting edge of understanding nonprofit finance and how philanthropy really needed to think through how it invested in nonprofits and social ventures to do it in a way that built strength and resilience. And at the heart of it is that we have an industry that was largely designed in the 19th century, and its business model isn't that different. And if we want to actually respond to the issues of the 21st century, it needs to change. And one of the things we'll talk about throughout this lecture is how this pandemic is leveraging change in ways that I could have only hoped for, except for the fact that it's the pandemic. So let me begin just by providing a couple of benchmarks into how I understand wealth inequality. For the last 20 years, Prosperity Now has issued a scorecard every January, which is the most comprehensive benchmarking tool that exists to show how each state, and we've expanded it so every community of 1,000 population or more helps to build the assets and wealth of their residents. And it's a fantastic tool. If you haven't seen it, all free, go online and check it out. As Dean Pinker said, this is the mission of Prosperity Now, and we've been very focused on what is the continuum of building financial stability and wealth for all residents of this country. So let's talk about some of the metrics that we look at. What drives income poverty? This is something that has reached wide discussion in the last month and a half. 1 in 5 jobs overall is low wage, and in several states, it's as high as 1 in 3. I just was interviewed for the Yale Insights publication, and I cited a story I saw in the NewsHour of 2 EMTs who were working in Rockland County, New York, where I grew up. And they were risking their lives every day and barely earning a living wage and had absolutely no health insurance doing this job. So this is one key metric that we look at. The other thing we've tracked is healthcare access. And I think all of us have heard multiple stories about who's covered with health insurance, how we have lost the gains we made through the ACA, as well as the implications of having an employer-driven system when so many people have lost their jobs. The third metric I want to raise up is a metric that we created over a decade ago to complement income poverty, to really measure the level of financial insecurity at the household level. We worked with several economists to create this metric of liquid asset poverty, which really says, do you have enough liquid assets to simply exist at the poverty level? So you can see how low this is for 3 months if your main source of income is disrupted. One could never have imagined when we created this metric how true that would be for so many households. Overall, 37% of American households are liquid asset poor. And you can see that's almost 3 times the rate of income poverty before the pandemic. You then can look at the numbers by state and by New Haven. 32%, slightly lower than the overall US level. In Connecticut, where we know there's extraordinary economic inequities, but 52% in New Haven. So that means over half of the residents of New Haven were living in a state of financial insecurity even before the pandemic hit. Then let's look at this by race. 3 years ago, we were able to disaggregate, and that's one of my very favorite words, disaggregate our data by race and disability. And you'll see overall, 58% of Black households and 58% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty in the United States. 29% of white households and almost 61% of households with someone with a disability. So this shows in the starkest way, until we get to my next slide, where the disparities exist. So 5 years ago, I got a call from the head of the economics unit at the NAACP, basically saying, I think that asset building and wealth creation strategies are the most important approach to addressing the racial wealth divide. I would like to bring my team to Prosperity Now to do this. So we did that, the equivalent of a nonprofit merger and acquisition, and they have helped us to build out an extraordinary piece of work around looking at the racial wealth divide. But it all starts with these numbers, which show, based on decades of policies, or centuries of policies, really, what the state of the median net worth is for white households, Black households, and Latino households. What it will be after this pandemic, I can only imagine. So what do we do? So part of what we did and do every day at Prosperity Now is say, that's the reality. Let's deal with that reality. How do we address it? Whenever I would describe the business model of Prosperity Now, people would look at me a little askance and say, oh, but Andrea, that's so complicated. Until one day I sat down with a philanthropic advisor at lunch, and I described our business model of marrying, public policy, private markets, and community practice, and he said, well, that's a very complicated business model, but you're trying to solve a complicated problem. And to me, that's what this framework is so effective for. It basically shows what are the elements by which we can build financial security and wealth. And one piece of this, as you know, is the ability to really navigate an increasingly complex financial system and make the right choices for yourself. We then have a whole set of skills and actions that people take. From how do we learn the basic skills, both to manage our financial lives, but also to have the jobs and work we need. How do we earn income, remembering the data on low-wage jobs, get the kind of benefits, tax credits that we need to support our households? How do we save both for emergencies and for longer-term uses? And then how do we build wealth and ownership? By owning a home, business, investments, or other assets. And then most explicitly, how do we protect those assets with insurance, consumer protection, and other services and policies? So this is a very short run-through of how we think about wealth inequality. But then, who helps to address and implement this framework? And that's really how I come to the initiative of charting the next wave of equitable finance, and how we think about leveraging the financial tools on behalf of a more inclusive economy. So this fellowship really began with analyzing the state of the equitable finance marketplace, bringing together a host of experts and actors in this marketplace. And let me begin by giving a shout out to the 5 research assistants who've been part of this whole process. Elizabeth Davidson, Brian Fike, Corey Barron, Alexandra Singh, and Vicky Zhang, all of whom, and I can't imagine how they've had time to do it, but have been incredibly valuable every step of the way as we have worked on this project. So we began really understanding that this marketplace is very much defined by profound inequalities in wealth and power, and few efficient distribution channels to really access and provide capital. This has been, both of these issues, a real focus of the work that we have done. The mantra that I learned when I was at SOM, which I must have recited virtually every day of my career, is that we build financial strength and resilience by matching our sources and uses of funds. So you have a sector that largely accesses capital that is restricted, short-term, and often limited to specific programs. That is completely counter to the ability to invest in the kind of things that actually build financial strength. And here is another quote from Clara Miller, who really traces all the implications of these nonprofits not having access to some form of equity-like capital, and what it means for how they can build their organizations, and what it means, and I think this is a particular perspective that being part of ICF has given me as I've met many people who make equity investments, is the role these investors play in really helping to build enterprises and organizations. And then what happens when growth comes and you don't have the kind of capital you need to support growth? The question that I want to ask everyone, if nonprofits are essential to the economy, especially during and post the COVID-19 crisis, how can we fix this? So one of the particular focuses of this fellowship has really been to look at philanthropic equity or enterprise capital. One of the really valuable pieces of feedback that I received during the course of the fellowship is that the term philanthropic equity was a little too complicated because everybody has their own definition of equity. Many people think of it in a purely private sector context. So the phrase enterprise capital has been a little bit more accessible for people to understand, and it essentially means the same thing. How do we provide the kind of capital to nonprofits that venture capitalists provide to companies that enable them to build the infrastructure, the human capital, the systems, and the strategy that's necessary for their success? And in their case, it's achieving profitability and growth. And in the case of nonprofits and social enterprises, it is really to achieve their mission. And in the case of particular organizations, not true of everybody, to achieve it at greater scale. One of the fascinating issues that we discovered over the course of different convenings, sessions we held at the Yale Philanthropy Conference, focus groups that I held at many industry events, is that we need both the nonprofit sector and philanthropy to really discard their sense of specialness. Because if everybody is special and if everybody does things in their own unique way, we can't really achieve the kind of scale and efficiency that actually is in the best interest both of donors and nonprofits. One of the most powerful insights that came out of our convening last fall was the description by the nonprofit CEOs and the social entrepreneurs of the cost of having to reverse engineer their businesses and organizations to meet funder requirements, and what the implications of those compromises were, both in their ability to operate efficiently and to achieve their mission. We also, and I want to thank again many of the faculty, particularly some of the accounting faculty who've been part of this, to think about how handicapped we often are by the language of nonprofit accounting, to really reflect the financial realities that nonprofits have, just like businesses. And really, they're just enterprises with a different tax status. And we need the same language in terms of how we account for our net worth, even if it's called net assets, that all organizations and companies need. And then finally, we need to think about leveraging this moment of crisis to transform philanthropic practices and how organizations are treated, along with the opportunity to think about business education anew. One of the things that we have discussed in light of COVID-19 and some of the big issues that we're facing in the government's response, which is a whole nother webinar, is what it's going to mean in terms of people's perception of the nonprofit sector and how critical they've been during this time. And this has really raised up an extraordinary strength of SOM, which we've always understood this, and what will the implications be for how we think about business education as we go forward. So let me just start with kind of where we've gotten to in this process and where we hope to go. So one of our goals was to say, if we want to provide capital to nonprofits and social enterprises in a way that really works to strengthen them and provide them with the resilience they need, what does it look like? What are our product design principles? One, we need to provide what's now called unrestricted funding at the level of the enterprise, not at the level of a program, not at the level of one site. And what this means to some of you, it may mean it's something called an operating grant. It may be called a organizational investment, but it's really something that is unrestricted by anything else than fueling the enterprise. The second is that we all can't have our own metrics. We need to track the results that are used by the metrics developed by these enterprises themselves, often in alignment with donors. But back to the reverse engineering quandary, what we really want to do is figure out how this capital is being used in the way the leaders and their staff have said it will be used. The third piece, and this gets back to the point I made earlier about how equity investors play a special role with an organization or a company, is really to deliver the technical assistance and capacity building services that help an organization strengthen their internal systems and infrastructure, accelerate their program development, and fuel their impact. I can't overemphasize enough how this kind of targeted technical assistance is often the difference between success and failure, and how being able to leverage the full range of human capital to do this is really important. And then finally, let's lower transaction costs, both in how we access funding, how we report, and how we renew it. If anybody has tracked the response of philanthropy to COVID-19, you may have seen a pledge that now almost 500 funders and donors have taken on the website of the Council of Foundations, which is in particular agreeing to this issue, which is lowering transaction costs, as well as unrestricting some of their funding. It is my keen hope, because the very last part of this pledge is, oh, and maybe we'll think about doing this after the crisis is over, that in fact we can fuel this momentum and build on it. So then, in a very provocative way, how do we liberate the capital that is available both in the philanthropic, but also in the private and public marketplace? Many of you may have seen a whole host of pieces on donor-advised funds. I'm not going to get into many of the controversies here, but I am going to say that going where the money is often the best place to start. And these funds have money that have already been released by the donor. They're sitting in different funds, and they are often available for much broader uses. So in fact, the team and I have been talking to managers of many of these donor-advised funds to see how some of their practices might be changing. A second huge opportunity is tapping foundation endowments. One of the great issues that has been raised is how bifurcated philanthropic organizations are, with a 5% spend down and then an endowment that sits there, and the message that is sent by the fact that the chief investment officer is often paid much, much more than the foundation president. So we know where the power is. We are now seeing the beginnings of foundation leaders thinking about how to tap their endowments to provide equity, guarantees, and direct investments in nonprofits and social enterprises. I was just involved in this conversation yesterday with one of the largest foundations in the United States, and have basically asked them to consult with ICF to think of some of the best ways to do this. Right now, we are in the midst of reinventing how to leverage public sources of funding to also, in some ways, enable organizations to simply survive with the PPP, but also to think about how to creatively use these public funds to support both households and organizations and lower the risk of private capital. I've been involved in a whole set of conversations with the largest banks, thinking about how we could marry their capital with the public funding, which is now deeply subsidized, and philanthropic grants to be able to experiment in ways that we never could have done before. And then the final part of our liberation strategy has been to think about creating and democratizing access to capital through online platforms. We had a fabulous workshop at the Yale Philanthropy Conference where we really talked about what these platforms could look like that help to match donors with nonprofits and social enterprises, and do it in a way that lowers the cost, but also gets beyond the one-on-one relationship model that we are part of now, which really duplicates in many ways the privilege that is now in our systems. So with that, let me talk about some next steps, and then hopefully we can have a really engaged conversation. One of the other benefits is that I was able to receive a grant to support some of this work from the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, who is seeking a blueprint for how they can really leverage a platform for enterprise capital, and have come back to me to say they see this as an essential component of their COVID-19 recovery strategy, as do many other philanthropists I've spoken with. I would love to continue to engage faculty who've been incredibly generous with their time students, and alumni in terms of product innovation, research and evaluation of what can be done, and then implementation. And in the biggest opportunity is how do we leverage the brand, the curriculum, and the mission of SOM to really serve as a leader in this work so that all organizations, regardless of tax status, can both grow and really fulfill their missions in the economy that comes next. So with that, let me thank you all again for this opportunity. It really has been a most marvelous chance for me. And the phrase I said is that by being able to be an executive fellow with ICF and partnering with the Program on Social Enterprise, it has basically enabled me to move ahead by coming home. So with that, Dean Pinker, I hope we've got some questions, or you can start it off.
Yeah, I talk too much in my job, so I'd like to get other people involved. And so, you know, you gave a very, you know, exciting and broad vision here, and I'm sure there are many things for people to latch onto and also to clarify, because these are, I think, complicated ideas.
Yes.
Please, anyone? I don't want to cold call, so can raise a hand.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Mika.
And introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm a joint degree with SOM and the Forestry School. Thank you so much for your time today. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tension between bespoke metrics and transaction costs and scale. It seems like sort of bespoke metrics that are developed by an enterprise is really important for meaningful impact, but at the same time, it could increase transaction costs and potentially be prohibitive for scaling some of these models across multiple enterprises. So how do you sort of balance that tension in your mind?
What a great question, and what a great research project one could do, right? So one of the things I think is that we actually don't know enough about this, right? How much does it actually increase transaction costs, right? And what are the real implications of this? And particularly as our command of data science has increased significantly, except in the delivery of testing and other things, how do we think about this? So my sense is it really begins with an alignment among the organization and the funder, whoever that is, and then being able to really show what are the core metrics that are most important. One can always add one or two that may be specific to a funder, but adding 15 is when the costs and the transactions become prohibitive. And also, this is one of the things that I didn't address at all, the whole overhead issue and nonprofit P&Ls, which basically one of my strategies in a class I did with Kate Cooney post-recession was to change the whole format of my financial statement. So what were overhead became direct. So how we think about being able to structure the financial information and the outcomes also matter. And then the final piece, Michaela, which I think is really important, is how do we structure evaluations so we continue to learn along the way? You know, one of the things in my work that we were very privileged is as we were building out the entire asset building field and testing match savings for the first time, nobody had ever done that before, testing children's savings, we had lots of funding for research. But the problem was, if they stuck to the RCT brand, the design of the research that was done 4 years before was completely outmoded by the time the results were in because of how profoundly our financial systems had changed. So how do we also think about creating the learning platform over time that helps us identify what are the metrics that really matter social entrepreneurs and nonprofit CEOs don't necessarily know that much more than anybody else. So they have to test along the way as much as anybody. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. Great answer.
Next, anyone? Well, Andrea, can I ask you a question? Why, you talked about moving away from restricted funds.
Yes.
And why do you think it is that so many donors want to restrict funds? What is the psychology there, and how do you change it? They don't, when they invest in Ford Motor Company, they don't say, oh, I'm buying stocks and I expect to be able to tell you which brands what cars to make, okay, and
Yes.
how many electric versus non-electric. Unless, of course, is it just, well, if I'm big enough, I will try to influence the board, and on the scale of philanthropies, it's small enough that individual donors feel that they should have more influence, or is there something else going on?
So I love this question. So let me start with a wonderful SOM alum, who many people on this session know. Colleen Briggs is a senior VP at the JP Morgan Chase Foundation and is actually in charge of their COVID response. And when we started this project, she sent me this fantastic video of what would happen if your local pizza parlor had been funded by a donor, and how they would try to restrict what you could charge for the pizza and all sorts of other things. So it is, and I'll share that with Marie if anybody would want that, because it's such a fabulous, it takes this argument apart step by step. So let me start with one big issue, which I've confronted multiple times. And that is the narrative that we still have in this country about why people are poor. And this narrative, which is a narrative we have attempted to refute from the get-go, is, basically it's because of people's bad choices that they have been poor. Several years ago, we had an entire scorecard dedicated to whose bad choices, and basically refuting each part of that narrative, which the data I shared from the scorecard shows you exactly. That narrative affects people in unbelievable ways. So one of the interviews I conducted for this project, I spoke to a dear friend of mine who works for one of the largest philanthropic advising companies in the United States. And he said he had just met with one of the donors who was very generous. And he had said to this donor, let's provide an operating grant to these 3 organizations because that's exactly what they need. And the donor said to him, but what if they go out and buy a Cadillac? These are organizations that had been supported and had been doing the work all along the way. And yet this donor still from someplace thought this. So I do think that narrative has really affected philanthropic practice. The second thing is that I think boards and others have not truly understood the financial implications of giving money this way, and have basically wanted to be able to report around siloed lines. There's a very famous foundation that will remain nameless right now, where one of my colleagues who worked there said, this is the loneliest collegial place you'll ever work. And it was how people were very siloed in their work and evaluated only on what they could produce out of those silos, which may somewhat reflect how we've organized business over the years. And then the third part of this, I think, is that we have not structured these organizations in ways that put this as the platform for organizations, and then said, okay, and then if you want to specialize, then you add to it. So that's the kind of third way I rethink the practice. But I just think that's exactly the question to answer. And we have a narrative issue. We have a lack of knowledge of how finance really works, and that nonprofits are really a business in just another form with a different kind of mission, and that philanthropy hasn't organized itself, although several of the largest foundations are now, to provide this kind of capital as its baseline. All right, if somebody else doesn't ask
Norbert, Norbert has a.
I know.
Norbert has a question.
Yes.
Great.
Go ahead.
Hey, hello. Good morning.
Good to see you again, Norbert.
Yeah, it was very nice to see you. Thank you for your time. So my question ties into your bit about narrative, and also one of the bullet points talked about how we need to, make better use of kind of public sector funds to maybe help de-risk some of the private market investment. And it seems to me that there's kind of this narrative that government market failures are worse than private market failures, and kind of we need to make sure that the gains from government intervention must always outweigh any possible losses. The examples like the Solandra, kind of bailout come to mind, to where the government took a big risk and it didn't work out, and they were skewered for it, even though it was probably still a worthwhile investment in the long run. So kind of how do you shift that thinking? And because that seems to be kind of the gating issue in terms of making sure that we do use public funds at a higher clip, and kind of take those risks that are necessary to maybe de-risk some of the private investment.
So I want to take that a step back, right? I think those kind of attitudes and other issues has really arisen from a 30 to 40 year campaign to discredit the role of government and its importance in creating the society that we all want and need. And if anything has been proven by this pandemic, it's that by not investing in crucial public sector functions, not showing the value of that work, and basically seeing government as a last resort, which I think is the assumption that goes into what you just said, we have all lost. Many people know that my son is a doctor in New York on the front lines of this epidemic. And thinking about the public servants who are serving now, and who he describes is saying we need to dramatically change our views of what is happening and how we respect government. With that assumption change, Norbert, I then also think that we need to understand what is the precise and highest and best use of government funding to fill the gaps in the marketplace, or to address the issues that are of greatest interest to all of us. And part of that depends on how the private sector markets are created, right? And the same issues in terms of reinventing the private capital markets post the Great Recession is relevant to the private sector as well as the public sector. So it's really a very, very interesting dynamic. I think this is going to be an area of huge creativity, because of the, if you just compare to what the government invested in 2008, which everybody thought was outrageous, it is just a teeny bit compared to what has already been invested. And there are future investments coming down the line. How does that completely reframe how we assess and measure public sector investment? Just a small task for you to take on. So I see another hand.
Yeah, Yun-san.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Hello.
Nice to meet you. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Hello. This is Unsaid. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I worked at a financial inclusion nonprofit and worked in fundraising. So everything you're saying about equitable finance makes so much sense. I'm curious also to hear, so you talked a lot about the need for philanthropy and how people are like, whether it's grant making and whatnot, to be transforming how they think about it. In terms of, and obviously there is an appetite for nonprofits that want this and need this, but in terms of the whole nonprofit landscape, like how do you see, what would be the challenges internally for that transition to happen successfully? For example, like whether it's human capital or best practices, like so far it's like nonprofits are forced to silo and report on these like random, sometimes metrics. So like, how do you see, where do you see the biggest challenges for nonprofits internally to transition into receiving equitable finance?
So I'm joking, but I'm not. Like, every nonprofit CEO should go to SOM. You know, I just want to say that the advantage that I had with my finance background, and let me say, I had an astonishing CFO. And our ability to understand our financial model, to adapt it, and our ability when, I don't know how many people know about temporary restricted income, net assets, but you know, one of the things I did is I negotiated for 2- and 3-year grants all the time. So I basically had my whole internal line of capital operating and creating liquidity. And I once had a program officer, who will remain nameless too, who in the 2nd year saw that I had a negative release funds because I had such a huge amount in earlier times and had absolutely no understanding of how temporarily restricted net assets, which is no longer a term of art because they've changed the accounting again, work. So since that's probably impossible, in my view, it's how do we get these concepts out so people understand them? And I have to say that I did a session at the National Conference of CDFIs. And this is, there's over 1,000 community development financial institutions in the United States. And they vary in size from small ones that may have 5 million in assets to very large ones that have over $1 billion in assets. And what I watched is those organizations that weren't the biggest, but were at the next level, understood intuitively everything I said, but nobody had ever talked to them about those issues before. So to me, it's also, how do we expand knowledge in a way that people can get it, that relate directly to their experience through case studies and other things that can get us there? And then finally, how do we have that shared among people who are investing and granting funds? So it's an excellent next career for you, I think.
Thank you so much.
Right?
I see Chris Lash has his hand up.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I guess I'm wondering if you can comment a bit on how you see this change bringing new capital into play. Obviously, it's a great way to make sure that philanthropies and donors are sort of serving their the nonprofits better. But I'm curious if you think it's going to attract more capital into the sphere in the first place.
Well, let's go back to my Liberate Capital frame. And several of the examples I gave are examples from post-COVID, right? So the conversation I had yesterday with the head of social investing for one of the top 10 largest foundations in America had gotten an agreement to look at how to use their endowment that had never existed before, right? And that her boss, who's an old friend of mine from college actually, had been trying to get for 5 years. So I do think that we are getting people to understand this more as long as we have leadership who gets it. And that we can only change so much. But I also think that our ability to really popularize this notion, to share case studies of how it works, to basically raise the profile of it. One of the things that we worked on as part of the fellowship is a landscape analysis of what kind of research has been done to really document the impact of philanthropic equity or enterprise capital. And the research assistants basically said that very, very little had been written in the last 10 years. So it just said to me, here's another gap that we need to fill to really document this outside of very specific philanthropies that had only written about their own use of this capital rather than a broader field-wide use. So yet again, I think that's an opportunity for all of us to think about. You know, every day I think, oh my God, this is the moment. How do I leverage it as just me? Not having my 85 staff there to use as I did in the past. So, but that's what I think we can do now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Morna has a question.
Sorry, hi, hello, how are you?
Good.
Thank you for that presentation. I had a question. I was wondering whether an organization would have to reach a certain scale in order to benefit from this type of investment. I come from a background of working in nonprofits, specifically community-based organizations, who are usually the best positioned to sort of outreach and advocate for and serve the most vulnerable communities in this country. But obviously oftentimes they're not as well resourced. I was just thinking about what you had said about the product design and whether, you know, there's, you know, we have to let go of this idea of specialness, but I think there is an idea of specialness for community-based CBOs who can do the work that larger groups can't for a variety of reasons.
So if I had to have a rule, Morna, and can I see you or you're not on your camera?
I'm not on my camera.
I would say that any organization with less than, 250,000 in revenues should only get enterprise capital. Because in these organizations, everybody does everything, right? And being able to predict exactly what you're going to do when you're deeply embedded in a community and listening to the voices of the people you serve to direct what you're going to do is a situation where trying to predict what you're going to do is almost impossible, although predicting that you're going to follow your mission is almost always sure. So one of these other rules to say is, for smaller community-based organizations, this should absolutely be the capital that they have, because there's no other way for them to plan or predict for the future and to address the range of needs that only they see on the ground.
Can I follow up quickly on that?
Please, yes.
I appreciate you saying that. I think I'm just thinking about the current landscape. And a lot of the way the current foundations work for the most part is that they don't see organizations that size having much of an impact because of the whatever particular metrics they're looking at.
Yeah.
So what do you think are the particular conversations that would need to take place in order to convince, for example, your most recent client or partner to really think through sort of these way smaller nonprofit organizations that are doing impactful work, but just aren't, you know, producing as high numbers, for example, as current philanthropic endeavors are looking for?
So I have two answers to that. One is we also have to match sources and uses of funds, right? For the foundation I spoke with yesterday, they're not going to fund little organizations, but they would fund me in my role running Prosperity Now to do that, right? To provide that pass-through. So I think there is a whole level of intermediation that happens in the sector by trusted partners that's necessary. But the other thing is for us to be, one of the most undervalued and used resources in this country are community foundations. those are foundations that have a lot of donor advised funds too. And to me, the match should be, that's who the community foundation should be serving first and foremost, and raising up that mission. Just in a small joke, the publication Inside Philanthropy gives out awards every year, and I love their awards because they recognize people who are doing great stuff, but they also recognize people who aren't. And the San Francisco Foundation is a community foundation that has been always the most progressive in America forever. And to be clear, it was founded by the grandfather of the man who founded Prosperity Now. So when Inside Philanthropy gave them the award for the most innovative community foundation, I was incredibly depressed because I thought, well, like by now, there should at least be another community foundation that's innovative. So to me, that's another platform that we should be really raising up to support these organizations because they're also much closer to these communities.
All right, thank you. Andrea, I think we're at the end of our time. Okay. And though, if we were in Evans Hall, you would probably linger a few minutes to just talk to people. So maybe we can just leave a few minutes. No one has to run away, but we could say it's officially, we're done. But okay. If you have a few more minutes, maybe you can linger for some more.
I'm happy, particularly if somebody has brought lunch.
Yeah. Next time, it's on me. Okay.
We'll go to Charlie's place, right?
Right.
Well,
God willing. All right. Great to see you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. This has been great. And a big shout out to Marie, who was incredibly helpful, and to Brenda, and to my partners at ICF and PSE. Thank you all for everything you've done.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
If anybody wants to stay on, I'm happy to stay for any questions.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Andrea. I don't have a specific question at the moment, but I just wanted to say the organization I was at before was EARN with Ben Mangan.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh my God. And my dear friend Lee Phillips now. How fantastic.